You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 3rd of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. It is 2100 in Seoul, 1300 in Zurich, midday here in London, and 7 a.m. in Washington, D.C. That is the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. The Briefing starts now. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Cermak. Coming up on today's program. South Korea's former president is impeached, but his arrest is blocked after a standoff at his compound. Supporters are celebrating and calling for Donald Trump's intervention. After that, we turn to the United States, where the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, faces a vote and uncertain future. What else is new, I hear you asking? We'll also get a roundup of arts and culture news, and finally,
using the Dozier School boys' images themselves, that's kind of where this sort of aching truth is built into the film.
The Nickel Boys in cinemas today. We'll speak to the film's director, Ramel Ross. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Cermak. We start with some extraordinary scenes in South Korea today as authorities were forced to call off an attempt to arrest the impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol, who tried to impose martial law on the country late last year. The whole kerfuffle has taken on a certain American flavor, with some Yoon supporters carrying "Stop the Steal" signs in protest of his ouster and in celebration of the failed arrest today. All this just in time for U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to travel to the region next week. Well, I'm joined now here in the studio by John Everard, former British ambassador to North Korea. John, Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too, Chris.
This is quite a way to start the year.
And
South Korea.
I mean, it's kind of spanned across the New Year divide, hasn't it? We had the great crisis on 3rd December when President Yoon declares martial law, only to have to rescind it a few hours later. And we had a failed attempt to impeach him, successful attempt to impeach him, an attempt to impeach his successor, the acting president, Han Duck-soo, who hands over to the current acting president, Tae Sang-mok. And now, as if that weren't drama enough, the investigators have launched criminal charges against President Yoon. Charging him with one of the few things for which you can actually indict a sitting president in South Korea, which is insurrection. So their room for manoeuvre was quite limited. President Yoon himself, of course, a former chief prosecutor. And let's not forget that. The guy knows the law backwards, has pulled every trick to thwart legal attempts to oust him, has said he will fight to the end. And he's sitting in his residence, surrounded by his security guard, who, of course, he's still president. The impeachment hasn't been confirmed, so they're still taking orders from him. And by units of his military, and he's still, through all this, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so constitutionally the soldiers have to do what he instructs them, and a large number of his own supporters who have blocked an attempt by the South Korean police to execute an arrest warrant on him for failing to appear 3 times to answer questions in connection with the charges against him. And as you just said, the investigators have had to back down. 150 of them, they came pretty mob-handed.
And yet it was not enough.
And yet it was not enough. They were still heavily outnumbered by the presidential security guard. Some of them actually entered the president's residence, but were faced with a kind of human wall of security guards who said they weren't going to budge.
It's incredibly extraordinary to have these kinds of scenes. I mean, do you have any sense then of what happens next?
Extraordinary, absolutely. One thing you've got to remember, this is Korea. Koreans love drama.
So does the rest of the world now. We've sort of adopted Korean drama.
Where every time we switch on the television news, we're all getting our bags of popcorn out and watch what's happened latest in South Korea, aren't we? But as so often in South Korea, I suspect there's a lot less to this than meets the eye. What we're watching is beautifully staged political theatre that the opposition, the investigators, probably never really expected to walk away with President Yoon. They knew, he said he'd resist to the end. They knew he was surrounded. They were making a point that they had charges against him, which, if they carried forward, might in theory result in the death penalty. So we're talking serious stuff here, or at least in a very long prison sentence. And I suspect that behind the scenes there are intense negotiations with President Yoon to get him to resign. A resignation in exchange for dropping the charges and probably for a safe passage out of Korea. Resignation, of course, would cut through all the complexities of the impeachment process, would give Korea a clean start and would give the opposition a clear run. So I suspect that President Yoon's team will be sitting thinking about where they stand now. Rather tellingly, the opposition have said that the investigators were in negotiations with the presidential security team, i.e., under what terms will you stand aside and let us through, please? And they know that, OK, they forced them back this time, but if he doesn't play ball, they'll be back.
They might be back, but is there, I suppose, even if these negotiations are going on, when you look at the scenes also of his supporters, is there a danger in all of this, with the dramatics especially on display, of sort of making a martyr out of the president? Is that something that one might worry about, that he actually does gain perhaps more support again as a result of all of this? Again, shades of the United States here.
Yeah, that is a danger that the opposition will have at the top of their minds. These people are perhaps a bit unlike the United States. These people are politically savvy and know how not to shoot themselves in the foot. They will not want the president to make a martyr of himself. Also, a point that's got kind of lost in the noise, a lot of his supporters are elderly people, and it's freezing cold in Seoul right now. Last time I looked, it was 5 degrees below zero. What you do not want is somebody camped out shouting their support for President Yoon who then dies of the cold. That would be optically terrible for the opposition. So they're treading carefully. Meanwhile, of course, in another part of this grand scene that we're watching, the Constitutional Court has already started President Yoon's trial. It started a week ago, last Friday. And nobody knows how long they will need to deliberate this. It might be only a few days, but it might take several weeks. It just depends how overwhelmingly compelling they find the evidence against him. If, in the midst of all this, the Constitutional Court confirms his impeachment, then two things happen. Firstly, the military is no longer obliged to follow his instructions. He's no longer president, and they take president instructions from that point from the acting president, who, as of an hour ago, was Jae Sam-hyuk. Who knows what's going to happen today? Secondly, it means that the presidential guard are no longer guarding the president, and they will simply melt away. In which case, President Yoon, if he's got any sense, simply walks out and hopes they don't press charges against him.
Just finally then, John, I mean, what do you make of some of these US comparisons? Because I am struck by the supporters, not only the Stop the Steal signs, but even some of these calls for Donald Trump to intervene when he becomes president. Is there any expectation of that? What is this kind of, I don't know, does this do anything for US relations? Antony Blinken is also, of course, there next week.
Antony Blinken there next week talking, well, hopes rather more sensibly to the South Korean government. This is a clear attempt by Yoon supporters to bring in the power of the United States, and they will have January the 20th ringed firmly on all their calendars. If they can hold out till then, I think a lot of them believe that although you and I might think it would be foolish for the United States to try to intervene, that doesn't mean that Donald Trump might not try to do it.
But is there any real sign of that? Does he really, do we imagine he cares?
What do you expect? I mean, Donald Trump doesn't announce his intentions in advance, does he? And so far, our good friend Mr. Musk has spared us his thoughts on South Korea, but I don't think that silence will last much longer. I expect before much longer, we will get Musk saying that Yoon is actually a misunderstood hero. Gasp.
Who knows what happens next. Thanks very much, John. I'm sure we'll have you back on at some point to explain all of this to us more. That was John Everard, former British ambassador to North Korea. And now here's Anita Ryota with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Government coalition talks in Austria have collapsed after the free market NEOS party announced it was pulling out of the negotiations. The NEOS had been in talks with the center-right People's Party and the left-leaning Social Democrats ever since the elections in September. The collapse of the negotiations leaves the way forward after those election results uncertain. Authorities have said they now believe the man who drove a truck into a crowd of people in New Orleans on New Year's Day acted alone. The assailant, Shamsud Din Jabbar, had an Islamic State flag with him, leading authorities to initially warn of accomplices. And finally, the French and German foreign ministers, Annalena Baerbock and Jean-Noël Barrot, are in Syria today, meeting with the country's new leaders in Damascus. This marks the first trip by a delegation from the European Union since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Baerbock spoke of a, quote, new political beginning for relations between the EU and Syria before arriving in the capital. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Anita. In the United States, it is déjà vu all over again as a Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives faces an uncertain vote at the start of the year that could throw the legislative chamber into crisis. Mike Johnson is the one trying to hold on to his job this time, hoping to achieve something that his predecessor Kevin McCarthy could not by convincing an unruly Republican Party with a razor-thin majority in the U.S. House of Representatives to keep him in office. Well, H.J. Mai is a journalist based in Washington, D.C. and joins me now. Happy New Year to you, H.J. There will be a vote later today. How likely is it that Johnson keeps his job?
Yeah, hey, Chris. Happy New Year. I think, for Johnson to keep his job, I think at the moment, the forecast is that he will keep his job. Maybe not on the first ballot, but I think he will survive in the end. The question is, will he remain in power then for the 2 years that Republicans are now in charge of the House? And I think that's a big question here.
Well, the big question is, yes, how long he might remain in power, even if he manages to win this vote, but also at what cost, I suppose. Do you get the sense sort of what the sticking points, I suppose, are for the sort of hard-right conservatives that might oppose Johnson, and what might he do to keep them on side?
I mean, that definitely, some, especially members of the House Freedom Caucus, which is very the far right conservative group within the Republican Party, they have come out and they have criticized his leadership style, especially working with Democrats on, some big legislative issues, especially, funding the government, which obviously is one of the, the main jobs that Congress has to do. So they've criticized that, but it's not as clear cut, the criticism when it comes to Johnson as it was with Speaker McCarthy, who obviously had to go through 15 rounds of voting before he was confirmed as Speaker and then ousted just 10 months later. So it's a little bit harder for Johnson to actually appease everyone because everybody seems to have a little different gripes with him and how he has been conducting the speakership over the past, a little bit more than a year that he's held the position now.
Well, and those gripes do include Donald Trump himself. That's been a kind of interesting relationship. Donald Trump is backing Mike Johnson for this role, even though Johnson, when you mentioned those budget talks last month, kind of defied Donald Trump because Trump wanted other things in that budget, including a debt ceiling raise, which he didn't get. So what do you make of that relationship?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think, both know that they will, as this new Congress starts and as the former president or now next president will, move into the White House, I think both know that they will need each other. And I think, even though their relationship might not be always, smooth, I think both of them have to work together and they realize that. And that's why Trump, over the New Year's days, I think on New Year's Eve, he spoke out publicly from Mar-a-Lago. And then he also sent out, a little post on social media, back Johnson. He might not be his favorite, but at least, both of them can work together. And I think, that's the relationship that we're at the moment. It doesn't mean that, as we know, that the president or incoming president might change his tune, should the speaker, go against his plans. So it's one of those relationships, that is just, a typical political relationship in Washington. It's down to power and getting your agenda through. And I think, given how slim the margins are in the House in this next Congress, I think, Speaker Johnson will have his hands full to appease everyone within his own party, the incoming president, but also try to work with Democrats, on getting some, once again, just like the funding issue, on getting some of those important issues through Congress. And so I think, that relationship will just evolve as time goes.
Well, he will have his hands full, and so will, though, frankly, Donald Trump potentially with this kind of razor-thin majority if Donald Trump wants to get his agenda through. And I'm curious, aside from also this vote, whether you get any sense that some of those sort of far-right conservatives, the Freedom Caucus, are they willing to work with Donald Trump? Are there some fractious signs there between the two? We did see a sort of fight over things like legal immigration between Musk and Trump and some on the hard right. I mean, but then there was also this debate over the debt ceiling and other things. So there are some signs perhaps that certain conservatives will not work even with Donald Trump despite his power. Is that talked about over there?
Yeah, absolutely. You just mentioned two good examples. I mean, there was, the debt ceiling issue, and then, this, kind of like social media back and forth that started out, over the last couple of weeks on, the issue of illegal immigration, and especially, when it comes to a work visa, a temporary work visa here in the U.S., which is known as H-1B. There's definitely a lot of talk about this, and I think it once again, once Trump will assume office, it seems like Republicans in the House and the Trump himself will have to figure out how to, appease everyone and work with each other. But there are definitely some hardliners, who might not simply pass everything that the president wants and have their own agenda and, want to represent their constituents. So, they're definitely, it's not going to be smooth sailing. And given the razor thin majority in the House, there will definitely be some topics that will lead to a lot of discussions and a lot of back and forth and maybe sometimes go against the president's will. And as we've seen during the funding fight, as you mentioned. And so, yes, there's definitely a lot of talk going on here. But at the moment, even though Speaker Johnson had to, probably convince a lot of hardline Republicans of voting for him again. It seems like he might not win on the first ballot, but I think he will win today, and those conversations will evolve, and we will see how much power House Freedom members, caucus members have in this next Congress, and if they have as much power as they showed that they have within the party the last go around.
We will see what happens. H.J. Mai, journalist in Washington, D.C., thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Cermak, and we're slowly letting our next guest settle in here. We had a quick turnaround there. It is time now for a roundup of arts and culture news with the arts journalist Amma Rose Abrams. Amma Rose, great to see you here in the studio. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year. It's great to see you too.
So, what can we talk about starting the year? I feel like we've had a sort of run of what 2025 will look like on a previous show. I remember we did. We have many more new things to discuss, obviously.
We do. There's not much news today. The world's just waking up.
We're all just waking up, exactly, from our sort of New Year's slumber. Yeah. But you do have a few things for us. We did want to start with a French cathedral.
Yes, it's like finally this long restoration project, a decade-long restoration project of a French cathedral. And it's these kind of drawings that were hidden behind the kind of where the choir would sit, and again then behind a kind of in a crawl space, these very, very old medieval drawings. And obviously, churches are built in increments, and so kind of as time passed, things get built on top and on top. And they discovered these drawings and wanted to restore them, but they had to restore them in this really kind of tangential way, and so someone had to crawl into the space, a team of kind of restorers, to record what the drawings looked like, and kind of in this very tight nook. And there's something like 8,000 photographs were then taken to Cambridge, and this UK-based team then pieced the drawing together, which apparently took a year. because of the way that the room is curved.
And there's no way to actually get in other than crawling into this hidden space.
And then over time went and recreated what it should have looked like, and then went and did the restoration. So it's this long-term project, and it's this kind of it's a story of it's a story of a journey of a woman who is kind of blessed by a saint and then travels to England. And the drawing kind of focuses on this journey to the UK, well, not to the UK, to old England back then, and it's it's a really beautiful drawing and just a gorgeous story of these talented and kind of really dedicated restorers going to extreme lengths to recreate this.
And how will we sort of be able to see this now that's being restored, or do we get a sense of at what point? Sort of,
there are some images of it. There are some images of it, but again, they're very tight in. I've been to see something like this in Rome, and what I had to do was to climb up scaffolding, go behind a kind of panel and climb up the scaffolding into the space and see it that way. So it might be something like that.
One of these days, they may introduce the crawl space version in France. Well, let's look ahead to a few other things that you have for us, kind of looking towards 2025. There's obviously going to be a whole run of exhibitions that we can talk about. You brought a little list for us. Talk us through some of the ones you're excited about. I'm
really excited about the Lee Bowery show opening at Tate Modern. I feel like post-pandemic, because of the huge planning time that comes in with planning shows, we've had a lot of historical shows, which wonderful shows. But this year we have a lot of younger artists, more contemporary artists, and more contemporary subjects. And Lee Bowery, obviously famous for his amazing performance art, his costumes, instantly recognisable, and for the Blitz Club, the early 80s post-punk scene. And kind of what that was, this kind of club, the dawn of the club kid era, I suppose, kind of post-disco and post-punk. And it's his costumes, his kind of iconic makeup, his whole, I wouldn't even call it drag, performance art kind of style is so iconic, but it also speaks of this time of DIY, of small subcultures and the impact that they can have, and this period in the UK when subcultures were having this global impact, which is really interesting. So I'm really excited about that Lee Bowery show. And then,
talk us through a few more, but when you say this sort of shift from sort of less historical, more to sort of younger, more contemporary artists, is that something swings and roundabouts? Like 1 year we do the history thing, 1 year we do the contemporary thing, or do you see a kind of trend in this?
I see a trend, but I think it's because it's for random reasons. So I think it's just because of planning and scheduling and these things. But I also think it's like just after... It just is easier to plan shows with artists who don't have to make the work for the shows, and it's easier to, I think, post-pandemic, it was easier to do historical shows in some ways because it was simpler to plan in those. I don't think it is always, but in those specific conditions, I think it was a simpler plan.
Well, walk us through a few more. We have a couple more minutes what you're excited about.
As Noah Davies at the Barbican, I'm really excited about him. He is a painter. He was an American painter. He died in 2015, and he at 32. But he is just a phenomenal talent. You see the paintings, they look like a Manet. They're paintings of the US. And he was a black artist, very young. He's mainly painting his surroundings. They look like post-impressionist kind of masterpieces, but they're of something completely other to that. But then maybe they're not, if you think about the observation of everyday life. It's just a different place. And he was just such a talent. I think to see a big retrospective of his work in the UK is a great kind of opportunity. There have been some in the US, and there was a good show of his work at David's Werner, who represent his estate. But he's just a phenomenally kind of interesting artist, sadly no longer with us, but he's an example of a contemporary painter just because of his age when he passed. So
Well, we'll be sure to check those few out. Plenty more that we'll be discussing with you as the year continues, I'm sure. I'm Rose Abrams, art journalist. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, the film Nickel Boys, adapted from Colson Whitehead's 2019 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Nickel Boys, is released today in cinemas. It tells the story of two African-American boys, Elwood and Turner, and their traumatic experience of reform school in 1960s Florida. It's the first drama from director Ramel Ross, who is known most widely for his work in documentaries. Nickel Boys has already been getting lots of attention in the run-up to the awards season, most notably for its formal uniqueness, shot mostly from the first-person perspective. Well, Monocle's Sophie Monahan-Coombs caught up with Ramel Ross to discuss the film, and she began by asking how he approached adapting the novel.
My co-writer and I were, maybe as expected, but deeply intimidated by the prospect of adapting the book. You know, after you read it, and then you read it again, and then you read it again, you realize it actually doesn't lend itself to adaptation. It's so, you know, for lack of a better word, perfect. It has its ecosystem of meaning, is so concise. I think what we did, it needed a distillation. It needed to be sort of purged and reduced to its essence, and then kind of taking that essence over to the new medium and seeing what the medium wanted to do with that. And that was how we proceeded. And I think during that process, we realized that was a way to kind of pay homage to the book, to not make the film its sort of lesser companion, but to try to see what the medium truly had to offer, Colson's kind of masterpiece.
Yeah, it really feels like something completely new, and there are so many choices. Maybe we can start off with the point of view, which obviously lots of people have talked about, but it is so striking and it's such a bold choice. Yeah, maybe you can talk about that decision to film from that first-person perspective.
Yeah, the point of view was a decision that is multifaceted. You know, it serves the idea of giving life and giving vision to Colson's characters, to the Dozier School boys, who Colson's narrative is about, essentially. It also allows the audience to share in their vision and in their experience. And I think that's where the real kind of breakthrough is that point of view, if you approach it more along the lines of how vision feels as opposed to what vision is, and you approach using the camera kind of as an extension of consciousness, if you can align the audience's experience of meaning making and the visual field with the characters, then you're allowing yourself to be in the world and not see the world while they're doing things, like not watching their behavior, but experiencing it simultaneously.
Yeah, and it works so well because you are seeing most of the story from the main character's point of view, and it feels very subjective, but you're always aware that the story is a wider one. It's not just about these two people. It's about a whole system and a much wider historical context. And you talked earlier about distilling the essence of Colson Whitehead's book and then building it back up into a new thing, into a new medium, both with the point of view and also how you move around in time, and also your use of documentary footage. I wonder how all of those different elements, it feels like you had a lot of freedom as a filmmaker. I wonder if it felt a bit like that. There's a lot going on, but it all kind of perfectly fits into the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, there is a lot going on, and I think one of the core, there's so many core things to the film as you're implying. It's really just full of ideas. one thing that Jocelyn and I wanted, Jocelyn Barnes is the co-writer, also a producer on the film, but one thing we wanted to do was to make sure that Coulson's narrative was connected to the larger kind of ongoing cultural conversation around race, around visuality. You know, you realize that in order for the Nickel boys and the Dozier School boys to be treated the way that they were treated by those who ran the school, but also those who, it's tough to call it a school because it wasn't a school at all, and those in the community, they need to be seen a certain way. They needed to be, it's part and parcel with the visualization of people of color over time. And so we kind of set out to find images that could offer not only a peek into the way that folks had been captured by cameras in different archives, but also the different modes of production that have sort of produced notions of Blackness. And the documentary element, I think, exists if you're kind of using any archival footage. It just feels like it's nonfiction or it's documentary. But using the Dozier School boys' images themselves and a lot of forensic images from the Dozier Report, which was done by the University of Southern Florida, that's kind of where this sort of aching truth is built into the film.
That was the Nickel Boys director, Ramel Ross, in conversation with Sophie Monahan-Coombs. The film is out in cinemas today. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riotta, our researcher was Gunnar Grunlund, and our studio manager was Alan Whedon. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Cermak. Goodbye, have a good weekend, and thanks for listening.